Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our panel discussion of AI's impact now and in the future. This panel is organized by TVBS in collaboration with HTC and VIA Technologies. And today, it is my great honor to introduce these two distinguished guests who are joining us in this panel. First of all, I would like to introduce Mr. Yann LeCun. Yann is the Chief AI Scientist of Facebook. He is also a professor of NYU, and many people know of him as the godfather of deep learning. And of course, the most recent development is that he is a Turing Award recipient of 2018. So Yann, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
And also joining us today is Mr. Edward Chang. So Edward is the president of HTC DeepQ, which is deep into the medical field for AI. And also he is an adjunct professor at Stanford University. Welcome, Edward. So both gentlemen are very at the forefront of research, as well as the cutting edge technology in the industries in their respective fields. So today when we talk about this topic, we will be able to cover from research, from academia, to industry, and maybe later on to society, all the impacts, opportunities, and the implications. So I would like to start off first with a question for Yann. You were here joining the IEEE ICIP conference this morning, and you gave a keynote, and the topic was around self-supervised learning. So most of the audience have some understanding of deep learning, but maybe self-supervised learning is still relatively new to everyone. So can you give everyone a little introduction of what this is? What is the background that led to this development?
Well, the type of learning that we use today, and first, the reason we hear about AI today is because of deep learning, right? It's because it started working really well, because of the availability of large data sets, and because of the power of GPUs, essentially. Manufactured in Taiwan, by the way. The problem is that the type of learning that we use in AI systems, the two paradigms of learning that are used, are considerably less efficient than the type of learning that humans and animals do. So the two paradigms that are dominant today in terms of applications, the first one is supervised learning. So supervised learning, you want to train a machine to classify images of cats from dogs on tables. You show it thousands of examples of images of cats and dogs on tables, and when it doesn't give you the right answer, you correct it so that the answer you want gets closer to the answer that's produced gets closer to the answer you want. So you give the machine the correct answer. Reinforcement learning is a weaker form of supervision where you don't tell the machine the correct answer, you just tell it whether the answer was good or bad, and it has to figure out by trial and error which answer was the best one. Those type of learning are very inefficient in the sense that they both require a lot of interactions, a lot of trials, a lot of samples for learning. So for example, to give you an example of order of magnitude, the standard issue image recognition system at Facebook, if you want, that is used to recognize a lot of stuff in photos that are uploaded on Facebook, is trained with roughly 4 billion photos, and is trained to predict hashtags, Instagram hashtags, basically. And then it's fine-tuned to recognize things that are interesting for Facebook to know. I don't know, you are interested in sailing or something, we're going to show you pictures of sailboats from your friends, but the same friend can post a picture of a cat. You may not be interested in cats, we're not going to show it to you. So it's important to understand content for that. So that's supervised learning. Reinforcement learning is even less efficient in the sense that if you want to use reinforcement learning, for example, the current best forms of reinforcement learning, to get a machine to learn to play one of the classic Atari games from the 1980s, it will take the machine the equivalent of 80 to 100 hours of practice to reach the performance that a human can reach in about 15 minutes of practice. So, then the machine can become superior to humans, but it takes a long time. And so it's completely impractical to use those techniques to, for example, train a car to drive itself. The car would have to drive for millions of hours and cause tens of thousands of accidents, run off cliffs, kill pedestrians. It's completely impractical. How is it that humans can learn to drive a car in about 20 hours or 30 hours of practice without causing any accident? And the reason is we have in our head a model of the world. We know how the world works, and we know that if we are driving next to a cliff and we turn the wheel to the right, the car is going to run off the cliff and nothing good is going to come out of it, right? So we have this predictive model that tells us, like, no need to try this. I know something bad is going to happen if I do this. So how do we get machines to learn those models of the world? That's the problem that self-supervised learning is trying to solve. Babies, when they're born, and it's true of young animals, observe the world and understand how the world works by observation. That's self-supervised learning. It's a third form of learning that we still don't know how to really do with machines, except in very narrow cases.
Thank you. And actually that leads to the next question, because in many occasions when you talk about deep learning, you use the term unreasonable effectiveness. And I think a lot of people in the audience could relate to that, because when we use AI, it just somehow works mysteriously. And I think in many occasions we saw even the words like alchemy and magic and these type of terms. But at the same time, when we look at, say, a 1 or 2 year old toddler, it seems like the kid, as you mentioned, doesn't have to look through tens of thousands of pictures to learn, what's a dog and what's a cat. So as intelligent as the machine seems to be right now, it still seems that there's a lot of missing pieces. So what's your view on that?
Right, so that's exactly the question, and why self-supervised learning, I think, is really the interesting topic at the moment, is that babies and baby animals accumulate an enormous amount of background knowledge about how the world works by observation. And this is, in my opinion, what leads to what we call common sense, which is really the ability to kind of fill in the blanks, right? You only see, you don't see my back right now, but you have a pretty good idea what it looks like, even if you've never seen it, because you have a good model of what humans are supposed to look like. So, you don't see the floor behind my chair, but it's the same thing. You probably have good inference that it's the same as in the front. And if I say a very simple sentence, so here's the sentence, very short. John picks up his bag and leaves the conference room. Okay, immediately you can fill in a huge amount of information about what's going on. You know that John is probably at work. He's picking up his bag probably with his hand. He's probably walking out of the room, he's opening the door, he's getting out of the room. Okay, all of this you can infer. But there is a lot of obvious things you infer which are not obvious. So things like, John is a man, probably. He's probably at work. He's not going to dematerialize out of the room. He's going to walk out. He's not going to fly. He's not going to attract his bag by telekinesis. He's not going to, once he's out of the room, he's not in the room anymore because he can't be in two places at the same time. There's all those background knowledge that you've accumulated about how the world works that seem completely natural. You take it for granted, but you had to learn all of this. You had to learn that the world is three-dimensional. You had to learn that there are objects in the world. All of this you learn in the first few months of life. How do we get machines to learn this? That's the root of the enormous amount of background knowledge that is necessary for common sense. So, we need to get this to work if we want machines to acquire common sense.
Thank you. And there's a lot of people talking about human level AI, or I don't know if there's a better term to that. So it seems like there's still quite a gap there. And based on what people are saying right now, or claiming right now, what are things that you find are realistic, and what are the things that you think are just unrealistic?
Yeah, well, human level AI, I think, is a good term. A bad term is artificial general intelligence, which is very AGI, which a lot of people talk about. I think it's a complete misnomer because human intelligence is actually very specialized. We don't realize it because we can't imagine any intellectual capacity that we don't have. So we think we're general, but we're not. We're very specialized. In fact, here is a good indication that we're specialized. And it's not such a good one, but particularly in Asia. When AlphaGo, AlphaGo Zero, and AlphaOpenGo, which is the Facebook Go player, were released, the best players in the world, the best Go players in the world, realized they were much worse than they thought they were. They thought they were maybe 2 or 3 stones handicapped from God, right, from the ideal player. In fact, they're very, very, very far behind. They can, be trounced by machines with lots of stones handicap. So people are just not as good as they think they are. And so this is a very narrow domain where machines are superior to humans, and there is a number of those domains. Hopefully soon, driving cars, not yet, where machines will be more reliable than humans. The general intelligence is a misnomer. Now, for human-level intelligence, there is no doubt in my mind that there will be a time that machines will have superior intelligence to humans in all domains where humans are intelligent. Okay, there's no question in my mind. Okay, not everybody agrees. Now, does that mean necessarily that humans will want to take over the world? Which is, the classic scenario in science fiction, the Terminator and all that stuff. And I don't think that's the case, because many of us here in the room are engineers, right? How many people are engineers here? Okay, we're scientists, right? Just about everyone. Okay, you're all very familiar with this personality of the super smart person who is very recluse, doesn't actually want to talk to anyone. Okay, I know many of those people. I used to be one of them. And so the idea that somehow the desire to dominate is linked with intelligence is not only false, it's even false within the human species. It's not the smartest among us that want to become the chief. In fact, we have very good examples of this on the international politics today, right? Kind of the opposite, actually. So the idea somehow that because you are intelligent, you want to dominate is just false. We want to dominate. Humans have some desire to dominate, or at least to influence other members of our species, because we are social animals, and that's the only way we can survive. But take orangutans. Orangutans are almost as smart as humans. Okay, we think we're much smarter than them, but we're only slightly smarter. Okay, their brain is about half our size, the size of ours. They have no desire to dominate anything because they're not social animals. So evolution has not built that behavior into them. So the desire to dominate is something you have to have hardwired in your brain for you to want it. And why would we do this with our AI systems? It would be pretty stupid.
So it sounds like for the human, there's something just hardwired, built in, and intuitive inside our DNA and our brain that just right now we can't explain that right now.
Oh, there's so many things that we can explain. Yeah, sure. I mean, we don't have a good idea for the sort of general organization of the principles on which the human mind is constructed. As I said, our machines use reinforcement learning and supervised learning. We know for a fact that the type of learning taking place in the animal brains is different. We don't know what it is. We don't have an organizing principle. So I think an interesting goal, which is really my scientific goal for a long time, is discovering underlying principles to intelligence and learning that apply equally to machines and humans and animals. There may not be such principle, it may be just a hack, in which case looking for a principle is a losing quest, but it's a good hypothesis. There's good evidence, due to the fact that the neocortex in mammals seems to be sort of fairly generic kind of learning machine. Those experiments where you take baby ferrets and you cut their optical nerve and you connect it to the auditory cortex, and all of a sudden the auditory cortex becomes a visual cortex, right? So it tells you the brain is incredibly malleable, and the function of a piece of the brain is determined by the signal it gets, not by, genes, essentially. So there may be a general learning algorithm of the cortex, and that may be a good thing to try to discover.
Thank you. And I want to bring the same question to Edward about human-level intelligence. And yesterday we were still talking about the human brain, how right now the cortex, we're talking about perception, but there are all the other parts, including knowledge, including memory. So can you share your perspective on this in reaching human-level AI? What are the gaps and missing pieces?
Right. Currently, we only see perception has been achieved pretty remarkably by using a CNN, so like image recognition, or even natural language processing. But we know we have 4 different lobes in our brain. Perception is only handled by the frontal lobe. So there are other lobes handling memory, knowledge, and so on and so forth. So recently, some neuroscience already discovered all the 4 different lobes, although their functions are different, but physiologically they are very similar. They are very similar. They are really like just neural nets, right? So hopefully the computational models to model 4 different lobes can be pretty much the same. Now the question is, how do you model knowledge on the neural net, right? Our intuition is perhaps knowledge is represented by natural language. If you think about knowledge, you think about a huge library, a lot of books, right? Human beings is different from animals because we can accumulate knowledge through our natural language. And so if you walk into a library, see so many books, basically they contain natural language and photos. If we can model those information and try to fuse with perception, maybe there is an interesting direction there. I think Yann also in one of the podcasts, you also probably mentioned about new mathematical models can probably fuse the two sources together.
Yeah, it's an interesting question as to whether language is an essential component of intelligence. And I'm on the spectrum of people who think, intelligence is intimately linked with language, and people who think it's not. I'm more on the side that people who think it's not. So, going back to orangutans or bonobos or even octopus, right? They're pretty smart and they don't have language. Orangutan, as I said, are not social animals. They don't even communicate very much with each other. So, except mother-child, basically. And they're still very smart. And they have abstract concepts. They can build tools. They build themselves little houses every night. They use tools. So we have to be careful. It's very tempting for humans to think that language plays an important role in thought because it's so strong for us. But there are forms of intelligence that do not require language. I think in the type of reasoning that I often do in engineering or creation or mathematics, a lot of people think in terms of analogy and simulation, and there is no language that plays any role there.
So we definitely have some differences here. So another possibility would be human passing sort of like pseudo information through genetics, right? So when we were born, we are not born with nothing. We were probably initialized by genomics.
For sure.
Yes. So maybe genomic covers certain knowledge about the present world. Perhaps like when I was born, even I don't know anything, but I'm hungry. I want to fetch certain food, whatever. So those are kind of like prior or maybe instincts and coming from DNA.
So I think it's very different for different species. So some species need to survive really quickly. They don't have time to learn. So they have a lot of behaviors that are hardwired and even perceptual systems that are hardwired. And that makes them survive, be able to kind of survive on their own quickly, but that also makes them very inflexible. And so humans, on the other hand, are extremely flexible, adaptable, which is what made the success of our species. But completely helpless for a number of years, right? Because we need to learn. So there's always this trade-off in machine learning of you put more prior in your system and you require less data to train it, or you put less prior but then you require more data. And it's the same in nature, right? So humans have probably less prior than we think, but it's still a lot. And a lot of animals like baby mountain goats can climb mountains minutes after being born, basically. So it doesn't have to be kind of a single principle. But what's interesting, to come back to a point that you made, short-term memory is handled in the brain by a completely separate structure from the cortex. It's handled by the hippocampus, and we find that also in artificial neural nets. That if we want neural nets to remember things, we need to have a sort of a separate memory structure, if you want, that allows it to do so.
Yeah, so every time these discussions go into the direction of biology and brain science, it becomes very interesting. It's a whole different universe of knowledge and discipline. So back to self-supervised learning. I see that there are some pretty good results in the NLP world. I saw some people take, say, a whole article and then just take out some words and fill in the blank, and it seems like it's really working well. Do you see it applying equally well in other fields like image or maybe video or other potential applications?
So we'd like to, but it doesn't yet. So yes, self-supervised learning is a big success in natural language processing. And going back many years to some of the early papers by Yoshua Bengio on neural language models, and then a paper by Colbert and Weston on basically training what amounts to a convolutional net to do NLP tasks. This is a 10-year-old paper. I actually won a prize, sort of the Test of Time Award at ICML last year. And then there was a technique that became very popular very quickly by Tomasz Mikolov called word2vec. And then FastText, which is produced by Facebook, and etc. And now, a year ago, BERT, which is an architecture and a system proposed by Google. And all of those systems use the idea that you take a piece of text and you remove some of the words and you ask the system to predict the words that are missing. In the case of BERT, it's you take a window of 500 or 1,000 words and you remove 15% of those words, and you train this enormous neural net called the transformer network to predict the missing words. And in the process of doing so, the system has to learn to represent text in such a way that it can make those predictions. And so it knows that the word that could be in the middle of a sentence has to be a pet, so it's either a cat or a dog, right? It can't be anything else. And so it needs to learn the grammatical role of words in the sentence, as well as the semantics, the meaning of the words. And so you get those really good representations of text. So the next thing you do is you use that representation extracted from text as input to a downstream task that may be supervised. And there's a set of standard benchmark tasks called GLUE, General Language, blah, blah, blah. I can't remember exactly what it means. There's a new one now called SuperGLUE. And the system that actually has the record of all those tasks is called Roberta. It's an improvement of Robert produced by some of my colleagues at Facebook. And does amazing feats. So one thing you can do, for example, is with 90% accuracy, you can solve what's called a Winograd schema. So Winograd schema is a type of sentence that was designed by Terry Winograd, one of the grandfathers of AI, to demonstrate that machines don't have common sense. And the sentence is something like, the trophy doesn't fit in a suitcase because it's too small. So the it refers to the suitcase. Or the trophy doesn't fit in a suitcase because it's too large. And now the it refers to the trophy. And so you have to ask the machine, excuse me, what does the pronoun refers to, okay? And it's got 50% of chances of getting right or wrong. Until about a year ago, the best systems were getting about 60%. Roberta gets 90%. And that machine has no idea of the real world. It's only seen text, it's never seen the real world. And so it's amazing how much knowledge there is built into text that it can actually do this kind of resolution.
So now again, we're diving into very different disciplines of linguistics and all that. And speaking of that, last week you gave a talk at the physics department at Harvard. And I'm really curious because I saw a number of your posts, and a lot was about statistical physics and quantum physics. So can you share a little bit about what you saw between neural networks, deep learning, versus the discipline and all the theories of physics?
Well, there's a long history of relationship between neural nets, machine learning, and physics, in the sense that in the second wave of neural nets in the 1980s, the field was revived by physicists. There was an article by John Hopfield on a connection between a particular type of neural nets, which we now call Hopfield nets, and what's called spin glasses. So spin glasses are kind of weird crystals with impurities in them, and the impurities play the role of like little magnets that can be up or down. So they're kind of like neurons that can be active or inactive, and they interact with the neighbors. And physicists have been interested in these systems because it's very difficult to kind of understand its behavior. And it turns out, it's very similar to how a neural net behaves. And so a lot of physicists started to get interested in theoretical neuroscience for that reason, and some of them actually became neuroscientists as a consequence of this. And then that interest sort of died a little bit when neural nets kind of fell out of favor. And now that it's coming back, there's a big question, which is why is it that deep learning works so well? Okay, it's not entirely a mystery. I mean, we have a lot of intuitive ideas about this, but we'd like to have more theory. And my hunch is that the methods of statistical physics will help. Also, some methods from applied mathematics, but there's a lot of methods of statistical physics, I think, that have a lot to say about this. So that's kind of one side. And there is some mathematical analogy also between certain type of neural nets that we use and quantum physics. So there's something called unitary neural net, recurrent neural nets. But that it's cute, not clear it's useful, but it's interesting for the sake of it. But then there is the other way around, which is the application of neural nets to physics, to experimental physics in particular. And during my visit at Harvard, I talked to all the experimental physicists there, and they all use neural nets for one thing or another. And it's true also of the chemists. So it's incredible. I didn't realize, even though I'm pretty much in the middle of it, I didn't realize how much this was pervasive. It's used for classifying trajectories of high-energy particles. It's used for analyzing the density of dark matter by analyzing gravitational lensing around galaxies. It's used for learning phenomenological models of materials to design new materials. I've learned, for example, that if you take a piece of graphene, which is sort of a two-dimensional carbon mesh, and you put another layer on top and you twist it a little bit, all of a sudden, for a particular angle, it becomes superconductor. Nobody has any idea why, okay? But maybe neural nets can sort of help explain this. And so if we could use neural nets to design new materials, that would be fantastic. There's already work in using neural nets to design new shapes with particular properties for airfoils, for example. There is work on using neural nets to solve partial differential equations much more efficiently than the sort of normal way of doing it, which has allowed a group of physicists in New York at the Flatiron Institute to simulate the birth of the universe and eliminate some theories about like the distribution of dark matter and whatever. So it's fascinating. There's a huge amount of development around this, and I think for chemistry and drug design, it's very promising as well.
That's great. I want to switch gears to talk a little bit from the industry perspective. So in a lot of industries, when they want to do AI, they lack sufficient data or lack good data, whether it's quality or quantity. Not like the internet companies, they don't have that luxury. So if they are to deploy or develop AI, what are some strategies that they can approach?
Yeah, so going beyond supervised learning is basically the answer to this. So if you can have pre-trained systems, and in fact everybody does this now. When you want to do image recognition, regardless of what the task is, you pre-train on ImageNet or some big data set you have access to, and then you fine-tune on whatever data you have. I guess it's something also that people are doing more and more in medical imaging, because that's one area where data is scarce. And so you you pre-train. And it's amazing sometimes that the pre-training can be done on data that has nothing to do with the final task, but it still helps. So the simple form of this is called transfer learning. The more sophisticated one, I guess, would be called self-supervised learning, and it's not entirely clear how to do it, because I didn't answer your question before, but self-supervised learning doesn't work very well for image recognition or video analysis yet. It's the main technical hurdle that hasn't been solved. And so that might be the big progress in the next few years. We'll see. But this idea of training on multiple tasks simultaneously, or training on a task for which you have data and then fine-tuning on the task that you're interested in, that's a good process.
And since we're talking about the medical field, Ed, I would like to ask you first, can you give us some introduction of the HTC DeepQ, and how do you guys tackle this problem?
Yes. The DeepQ started about 5 years ago because at the time we were sponsored to enter a competition called S-Prize tricorder. So if you don't know the notion about tricorder, this is a device in this Star Trek episode whereby a character called Spark. And the weight of the device is about a cell phone. and he can use the device to diagnose diseases and right away cure the disease. Right? Curing disease using a device is unthinkable, but diagnosis, I think today we can do it. So during the competition, basically, we designed a very small box with different IoTs. We can successfully diagnose about 12 different diseases and also monitor vital signs. So the whole process, the biggest challenge is small data. And the small data problem in healthcare coming from many reasons. One is privacy, because people really don't want to give out their data, and the hospital doesn't want to share data between different entities. And also, because of so, the quantity is not sufficient, annotation quality is also insufficient. If you want to pass the FDA process, if you have a classifier, you don't just publish a paper, you have to make sure every single data has been annotated by 3 experts. Otherwise, FDA wouldn't give it approval. At least Taiwan FDA has that kind of regulation. And finally, the data has to have diversity, right? The disease has different manifestations. For example, like otitis media. Otitis media has different characteristics. So therefore, your sample has to cover all different diversity. And so what we have done was, we have to encourage data sharing. So we started building this multi-layer blockchain, which can ensure not only privacy preservation, but also ensure scalability. And the second thing we have done is to try to improving diversity. So this is a little bit technical, but we can probably discuss in a more specific kind of environment. Quantity, right? Blockchain is actually a way not only to encourage privacy, but also because privacy gets preserved, people may be more willing to share data. And the blockchain may sound like a hype, but if you can issue coins, blockchain economy, and that's a way to pay for physicians willing to annotate the data and pay for the patients willing to share their data. So this is pretty much our directions in the last few years.
Thank you. So besides medical, another interesting area that really benefits from deep learning is autonomous driving. And that's something that VIA Technology is working on. So we've really benefited from your work on convolutional neural networks. Thank you. Now, when it comes to autonomous driving, most of our customers right now, they use different pieces of the technology for safety, for alerts and all that. And when we look at true autonomous driving, when we look at companies like Waymo doing that, while there's a lot of learning there, it still seems quite engineered. I think the conditions, it's all preconditioned. So to break that barrier, to have more learning and less engineering, less conditioning, what does that take?
Well, I think it's a natural progression. It's sort of in the history of AI engineering in general, there's been a natural progression from kind of hand engineering everything to using a little bit of machine learning to basically learning the whole task end to end. So, and that's happened repeatedly in character recognition, speech recognition, image recognition, now natural language understanding, right? Where, translation systems, for example, the speech recognition system are trained completely end to end from raw waveforms to character sequences. So I think it's a natural progression. Now, for autonomous driving, I think we're still in the phase where we need to engineer a lot of stuff for it to be reliable. And the economic incentive for it is there. So there is enough economic incentive to build things that you can devote large engineering teams. You can map the entire world, have 3D models of the entire domain where your car is supposed to drive. You can put expensive sensors on the cars because this will be managed fleets in the case of Waymo, for example. So they can over-engineer the car, put lots of sensors on it to kind of solve the reliability problem. But progressively, I think there's going to be less and less exotic and expensive sensors, maybe no LiDAR anymore. There's going to be less and less reliance on prior mapping of the entire world, and more reliance on sort of regular perception through cameras and simple sensors. So, the first practical autonomous car is going to be fleets, not consumer cars, and they're going to be over-engineered. And they're only going to drive in areas that, where the roads are wide and the drivers are nice and the weather is good, and basically suburban Arizona, right? Which is where Waymo is actually carrying its test. But then, bad weather, aggressive drivers, dense drivers in cities and stuff like that, it's going to take a while before you see autonomous cars in Place de la Concorde in Paris or in the middle of Mumbai or New York City. So, but I think we're going to see that progression. And it might happen because of progress in things like self-supervised learning and more common sense, etc.
And also, I think with this whole awareness and boom of AI, a lot of industries are aware of this and really wanting to deploy it into their business process. But most of these are not technology companies, so the understanding sometimes is relatively limited. And I think maybe Hollywood plays a big part in this. On one hand, you have people who have unrealistic expectations. They think that the digital assistant should work like Jarvis in the Iron Man movie. There's that expectation. On the other hand, there are a whole category of movies where things go wrong and the machine takes over, starts writing its own code, and just everything goes down from there. So in between these, fear and overhype, if an industry or if a company were to deploy AI, what advice would you give them?
Well, so there's a number of startup companies that have set themselves as basically consulting to help large companies, or not large companies, but non-tech companies to deploy AI. Element AI was one of the first to do this, based in Montreal. And there's a number of companies that are trying to do this. So this is to help disseminate the technology across the whole economy. Economists that I've talked to say that it takes roughly 15 to 20 years for a technology to disseminate in all corners of the economy so that the effect on productivity is detectable. So right now, there's no detectable effect of AI on the economy. AI increases the productivity of everyone, but not enough yet. Okay, it's not measurable. So it might take another 5, 10, 15 years. It takes basically it's not one generation, but it takes about 20 years, and it's been true for computer technology, it's been true for the electric motor, it's been true for just about everything, going back decades. And the interesting notion there is that what limits the speed at which the technology penetrates every corner of the economy is the speed at which people learn to use it. And so if a country or a region wants to take advantage of the technological revolution like this one, the best thing they can do is invest in education. Not just initial education, but also continuous education for people who are already on the job market, in the active world.
Thank you. And I want to bring that same question to Edward. In the medical field, you work with a lot of hospitals and medical schools. What is their attitude and expectation, and what is their anticipation for AI deployed in their area?
Right. I pretty much agree with Yann. All the AI experts, most of the AI experts, would like to join the IT company. Because if they join another kind of, let's say, pharmaceutical company, they may not have a very glorious career, right? So I think the medical community, they should focus on annotating data, providing high quality data, and let AI training or AI modeling for the IT company to deal with. So because of this reason, and we are trying to facilitate this application developer to say, well, we can use AI to help you AI. In AI, like deep learning, there are quite a few parameters need to be tuned. So like learning rate, or like mini-page size. And also in the system level, there's a I/O situation, and how many GPU you need to employ, right? All these things, and also model selection. I think most of the let's say healthcare industry people or doctors, they really don't understand those. And end up, if they want to do a training of their model, it can be very time consuming, because even we say the parameter tuning, if you do 10 different combinations without using your GPU machine properly, it can take you weeks or months, right? Why not let AI to solve AI? So we really like to encourage people to say, well, if you are in a particular segment, focus on providing high quality data, then let IT company to help you to facilitate the training and also shrinking the model size to be practical.
Thank you. So we're going to extend this a little bit beyond industries. Let's talk about globally how different regions are looking at this. So since both of you travel around the globe, and AI development really is a global movement right now. So do you see differences in different geographical areas, whether it's US, EU, Asia, China, in terms of their strategy, their priority, and where they put the focus on? Yann?
Well, yeah, certainly there is a difference of approach. I guess China has been extremely active in sort of promoting the development of AI in industry. There is good level of research going on in China, but not yet to the level you would expect actually. It's a little behind, except in computer vision. There's really good research in computer vision, but outside of that, not so much. But there's a huge amount of deployment in industry. And there's certainly a lot of interest from young people for the topic. So there's only 2 cities where I get recognized on the streets. One is Paris, because I'm a minor celebrity in France, and the other one is Shanghai. Okay, but admittedly I'm easy to spot in Shanghai. Okay, so I think there was it was explained by Kafuli as perhaps a result of what Americans call the Sputnik moment. So Americans were really surprised by the Russians sending Sputnik, right, in space before that, and that sort of gathered all the forces in the U.S. to sort of try to kind of beat the Russians essentially. And what Kafuli says is that there was a similar moment in China as a result of AlphaGo, where a machine coming from the West was beating the Chinese at their own game, right? That was and so that sort of gathered, motivated people to really sort of get interested in the topic. I mean, it's really quite remarkable what's happening. Now there is some bad aspects to this, and I feel partly responsible for it because of my role in convolutional nets. There's wide deployment of surveillance systems and face recognition systems to basically control populations in China, and that uses technology that basically had something to do with, and I don't feel very good about it.
Edward, how about you? What do you see in terms of geographical differences and focuses?
I think healthcare is mine because of our own focus. Because current crisis is the demand is very high, but the resources is pretty limited. Right? People worry about physicians may be out of their job, but I think this is probably impossible because there's just more demand, and if the quality go up, the demand will further increase. Right? So I think globally healthcare should be a good topic, and we should focus on that. And in healthcare, let's compare healthcare with self-driving vehicle. Do you love your children more than your car? The answer probably, if you are rational, should be yes, right? But how much data do you know Tesla collect from their vehicle every day? It's more than 1 gigabyte. How much data do we collect from ourselves, from our children? 0 byte, right? Unless we get sick. So this has to be changed. So globally, if we can start to collect sufficient data from human and tap into this data-driven AI and tap into neural networks, we should be able to improve healthcare very, very drastically.
Thank you. And there's some discussion right now about, because of how unreasonably effective AI is sometimes and how it just works. So there's a discussion about if you create a machine that has maybe 99 or 0.9% accuracy, but you just can't explain it, versus you have something probably less accurate, but at least you can give reason or explain or can trust the data, perhaps, or the results. So is there a geographical difference in terms of the view of philosophy or where they stand position-wise?
I don't know if there is a geographical difference, but I think I have a very unorthodox position about this, which is a lot of people will tell you that providing explanation for the AI system is absolutely crucial to create trust, and I completely disagree. I've been in the situation many times in the past where I've built some complicated neural net that most users would not understand. That we're getting, I don't know, let's say 95% correct on some task, right? And then I can also build a simpler system, logistic regression or something like this. that is completely understandable, and that only gets 80% correct. And then you offer the two systems to the person who just a minute before looked at you in the eyes and said it's very, very important to have explanations, right? And then you look at which one they pick.
Yeah.
They always pick the one that does 95%.
Whatever works.
Exactly. So what matters, so explanations are just a way to reassure people, because people like to be reassured, but in the end, they will trust the tested system. Now, here is an interesting piece of information in the context of medicine. Some of the most used drugs today have mechanisms of actions that are completely unknown. For example, to treat bipolar disorder, manic depressive cycles, people take lithium. It's very simple. It's not even a molecule, it's just an atom, right? Nobody has any idea how it works, but it works. And it's been used for decades. Until the mid-1970s, we had no idea how aspirin worked. Aspirin is the most used drug, in the history of humanity. As long as something is proven to work, has been thoroughly tested with well-established procedures, people trust it. I mean, most medical tests are not 100% reliable. They all have a precision recall curve or selectivity, whatever it's called in the medical domain, right? I mean, it's an ROC curve basically. Any detection of anything will have false positives and false negatives. And some of those tests, like the test for Lyme disease, for example, which is prevalent in the northeast of the United States, is extremely unreliable. But people still use it because there is nothing better, or the alternative is so expensive that you're not going to do it just for screening. So, they use the information knowing full well that it's not completely reliable. I think we should do the same with AI. So, we should have good testing procedures that are open, kind of like the way we test drugs, or the way we test cars before putting them on the market, or airplanes. We certify them before we can put the passengers in them. And those have to be, regulated by some government agencies or something to make sure they're safe.
And another piece of it, of course, is data. We know how data is very crucial to any development. And right now, the EU is really pushing GDPR. And since you mentioned Paris, so I would like to ask you what you think, how GDPR, the policy or the approach that they're doing, is that going to impact the development of AI, or is it actually pushing them to look for different ways of innovation?
GDPR really doesn't have much impact on AI. I mean, the effect for most of us is that, we see this thing accepting cookies or not, right? But it's more than that. In fact, it's more like protecting private data. In fact, Facebook decided to, very early on when GDPR was put in force in Europe, Facebook decided to apply it to the entire world. So there's really good things in GDPR. I don't think it impedes research in AI at all. There are other obstacles to, for example, certainly applying machine learning to medical applications, you have to have access to data. But in France, for example, the government has an initiative for the development of AI, which essentially puts together some sort of central repository of data that is accessible for researchers in the context of healthcare. So, you can, if there is, political will, I think those things can be done.
And so earlier we were talking about how AI is going to potentially impact the job market, automation, and all that. So and both of you are innovators, researchers, as well as educators, right? So I think from that aspect, if you were to speak to a student right now, or a kid who is not in the job market yet, how would you suggest or recommend him or her to prepare themselves for a future where they just have to work with these AI tools that seem very smart? Ed?
Well, I think if you consider what kind of job will be replaced, basically if the task can be put into a computer loop, it's very routine kind of work, probably I would advise my kids don't get into it. As long as the task is the innovation, is unique, like art or writing, even like science, innovation, so those couldn't be replaced by AI in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, in the non-foreseeable future, everything will be replaceable by AI. But you have to, I think what's more interesting is to kind of try to understand the dynamics of the value we attribute to things changes because of technology. We were just talking about this at lunch earlier. You can buy a Blu-ray player for the equivalent of $50 US. Right? It's very cheap. It's an incredibly sophisticated piece of technology. The manufacturing of it is entirely automated mostly, but it has blue lasers, H.264 video compression, incredible servo mechanisms for following the Blu-ray. I mean, it's a ridiculously sophisticated piece of technology. How can it be that cheap? It's just amazing. Now, you want to buy a handmade ceramic bowl. The technology is about 8,000 years old, maybe 10,000 years old. It's going to cost you about 10 times more, about $500, at least in certain parts of the world. What's the difference? The difference is human experience, authentic human experience. It's a unique piece, as opposed to kind of a mass-produced piece. And so there are many examples of this type where the human experience is what costs money. The creativity, or the experience of human creativity is what costs money. So you can download a song or for either zero or a very small amount of money, your favorite piece of music, whatever it is that you listen to. You want to go to a concert, it's going to cost you a lot of money to go to the concert. And so the difference is the authentic human experience. You want to go to a fancy restaurant, it's going to cost a lot of money, and there's a lot more of those things now than there used to be. It's because we give it more money now. It's the you want a Louis Vuitton bag or something, right? That costs a huge amount of money, not because it costs a lot to manufacture. It's just that it's the prestige that's attached to it. It's the brand, right? Now, the French industry kind of relies on this a lot for wine and things like that. So the value we attribute to things is evolving, and a lot of it now is kind of perceived value as opposed to sort of manufacturing cost. Manufacturing costs are going down, so material goods are going down in price, and then human experience is going up. So all professions that require human creativity, human contact, have a bright future. I think there's a bright future for jazz musicians. Because it's improvised music. The best experience you can have of it is to actually listen to it live. So my jazz musician friends in New York make fun of me when I say this because they struggle, most of them. But but it's quite possible. I mean, it's kind of a bit of a joke to kind of show this example. If you are interested in science and technology, learn things that have a long shelf life. So learn math and physics, basically. Don't learn like the latest, language that just became fashionable last year, because 5 years from now nobody will talk about it anymore. And you can learn it on your own. So learn stuff that's hard to learn.
How about for a recommendation for us who are already in the marketplace, maybe 10 or 20 years? Does that same strategy apply, or because most of us are not jazz musicians? So what can we do, or what can we do to prepare ourselves?
Some of us wish they were. Or wish they were better at it. Well, never stop learning. That's pretty clear. But I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I mean, certainly as engineers, at the forefront of technology, we sort of have to learn all the time, and that's, to me, that's what really makes life fun, actually. So that's really what I enjoy.
Thank you. And so we're going to enter the Q&A session, and because I have the privilege to share this stage with you, so I'm going to go off with my question first. The question I want to ask is that, what books are you guys reading recently? It's interesting to share. I love to read. I want to know what everyone else is reading. So is there anything you guys can both share a little bit?
My recent 3 books I read, one is Genome, the other one is I took a course in Stanford last quarter, The Cure for Cancer. So they talk about chemotherapy and the target therapy and immunotherapy, and why certain things will work, why certain therapy may not work. And that's really, really enlightening, especially learning more about DNA, and you have to believe God exists. So the second book, second genre I read was totally different. I was reading Taoism. Taoism written by Lao Tzu, ancient Chinese philosopher. And this book actually written by an American. And he really wrote a book like writing a thesis and analyzing all different translation editions. So his summary is actually only two simple conclusions. One is, what do you mean about doing nothing? Doing nothing, really not saying just don't do anything at all, but doing nothing aggressively to other human beings. Because anything you doing aggressively to other people, you build up a negative cycle to be against yourself. So that's one thing. And another thing I learned was that we always really want to return to our primitive mode. Be honest, be naive, be natural, rather than be cunning or sophisticated. So it's very helpful sometimes getting into research, sometimes getting into some kind of spiritual learning.
Thank you. Yann?
So I have a bad habit of actually reading several books at the same time. And another bad habit that I come in a minute. So I've been reading a book which actually only exists in French. It's called Les Fous du Son. I don't know how you translate this. The crazy about sound. The crazies about sound. This is about the history of the analog synthesizer. Okay, so I play with synthesizers for fun. I'm kind of a bad amateur musician. And I've been playing with synthesizers. I got into computers actually because I wanted to make music with them. So, I mean, not just because of that, but that was one reason. So that's one book. Another book is called Animal Minds. And so it's about animal intelligence. And it's one of the things where you realize that every intelligence of every animal, including human, is very specialized. Another one specifically on octopus. So octopus have a very strange biology, completely different type of intelligence. They have a distributed nervous system. It's not completely centralized like ours. They have intelligence in their arms, in their suckers. And so I find that mysterious, so I kind of read that. There's a couple others, but what I've been doing mostly, besides reading, is actually writing books. So.
Okay, thank you. And since one of the books you mentioned is about sound audio, one of the pre-submitted questions is around audio, AI development for audio, because we talked a lot about images, we talked about video, we talked about that, but what about audio? What about sound, especially the human voice? Because when somebody talks, there's a lot of information that's inside of it. You can tell the gender, you can pretty much tell the age, and maybe with the accent, you can also tell the social and cultural background. So is there research going on there that's interesting that I can share?
Yeah, if you're from Britain, from your accent, you can tell where you grew up within 20 miles or something, right? Yeah, there's got to be the work on this, right? Both on just audio, on speech, and on music. So using deep learning for sort of various aspects of this. There's got to be the work on voice cloning, so turning someone's voice into someone else's voice. That works pretty well. There's kind of a similar technique that was developed by the Facebook AI research group in Tel Aviv on sort of music transformation. So you whistle a melody or something, or you play it on a flute or a guitar or whatever, and then the system can basically turn it into a symphony. I mean, it sounds like an orchestra, sounding. And it's essentially a GAN, generative adversarial network, doing this, or a similar technique. So there's fascinating applications of those new techniques, which for the time being have okay quality, not great. And I think they're going to make a lot of progress over the next few years. For sound synthesis, for speech synthesis. Speech synthesis is already really good. There are kind of pretty good demonstrations of this with the WaveNet type systems, but other approaches as well. And I think the possibilities are really mind-boggling.
Here's another question from the audience. So this is for you, Yann. Yuval Harari, one of my favorite authors, he talked about how the control of data is basically a control of power of the 21st century. And so the question is, how can AI be regulated to avoid abuses of power by governments or big corporations?
Well, it's kind of it's sort of like communication systems in the mid 20th century, like oil in the early 20th century. So all of those things kind of became essential to people. In the US became monopolistic and therefore became regulated. Standard Oil basically took over and then was broken up by Teddy Roosevelt. AT&T wasn't called AT&T yet. Took over all communication, which was good actually because it allowed people to actually call each other from one city to another, which was not possible before. But then, of course, was kind of dominant and had to be regulated, so it became a regulated monopoly. So the question is, should this happen for social networks, for search engines, for whatever it is that collects our data? I think ultimately the question is, who do you trust with your data? Right? A lot of companies have access to your most private data. Your phone service provider has access to your data. They know where you are minute by minute, right? They know which website you visit. Your ISP at home also knows that, right? Now, a lot of developers of apps that you install on your phone also know a lot about you, without necessarily you wanting them to know. And you might trust some large companies that have a reputation to protect, to really kind of do a good job of protecting your data. But what about this app that you just installed that is made by some teenager in Croatia? What do they do with it? And that's one of the things that got Facebook in trouble, which is to trust developers to abide by contracts that they had for distributing data, and they realized they weren't, and so they shut down the platform. But they didn't do this until after the Alexander Kogan and Cambridge Analytica got some data. So who do you trust with your data? That's the who is going to protect your data against attacks by other companies, by nefarious actors, and by governments?
And there's a follow-on question, and this one is for Ed, that's kind of similar but more looking from a research perspective. So the question is, with multiple industry players attempting to gather their own private data sets, is there a risk that our data will become increasingly fragmented and less useful for AI research?
Definitely that's real nature, right? Suppose like medical data, I go to 2 different hospitals, but they don't allow me to share my own data, then my whole medical history cannot be compiled. And that definitely is an issue. So one thing we have been working on is, can we create an infrastructure to allow sharing to be privacy preserved, and also at the same time to be fair to the custodian and also to the owners.
Thank you. And we have some more time that we would open up to the audience here. If anyone has questions, we have a microphone there, and you can raise your hand and you can start.
I have a question about reinforcement learning. In the past decades, there is much progress in the research of reinforcement learning, and much of that is done in virtual environments. But in real-world problems, many real-world problems are too complex to have a virtual environment. So, if you want to train an RL agent and deploy it to real-world problems, what can we do?
Well, that's an excellent question. It's a big issue with reinforcement learning. The fact that the current approaches to reinforcement learning require a huge amount of interactions, and so they only work in virtual environments for that reason. So, for example, reinforcement learning has been surprisingly unsuccessful in the context of robotics. Training a robot to grab objects, for example. It's made progress, but not quickly enough that it's really exciting. The most interesting research in that direction is around what's called model-based reinforcement learning, and it's connected with what I was talking about with self-supervised learning. So basically, you train a predictive model of the robot that predicts what the robot is going to do as a consequence of an action, torques on the motors or whatever. And you don't just predict what the robot arm is going to do, but you predict what the effect on the world is going to be as well. So if you have a model of this type, then you can use what's called model predictive control, MPC, which allows you to plan in advance a sequence of actions that will reach a particular goal. The problem is to learn this predictive model, and that's what self-supervised learning is about, like predicting, the next state of the world from the current state and the action you take. So there's really interesting work in that direction that comes out of the Berkeley group. Sergey Levine, Peter Abiel, and Chelsea Finn, who's a former student of Sergey Levine. She's now at Stanford. And there's some work along those lines at Facebook. There's some work I've done. So that's really sort of a promising area, and that's why again it comes back to self-supervised learning.
Hi, Dr. Yann LeCun and Edward. I have a question about human-level intelligence and causality. Previous tuning award winner Geographical said human-level intelligence is an achievable goal, and causality is part of the solution. Do you agree with his perspective?
I agree with some of the things he says. So, I mean, certainly causal inference is something that humans appear to be able to do, but they don't do it very well. It's very difficult, in fact, to establish causal relations. So, for example, you ask a 5-year-old child, what is the cause of the wind? And many children will say, oh, it's probably caused by the movement of the leaves of the trees, right? The trees move their leaves, and that creates the wind. Okay, so that gets the causal relation backwards. The entire history of religion in humanity is there to prove that people are extremely bad at attributing the root causes to things that happen in the world, right? They search causes for everything that happens and attribute it to divinities, which is, mostly wrong, probably completely wrong. So, if you're rational. So we're not very good at it. And the question is whether it is the ability to do causal inference is an essential, specific part of AI that you need to kind of hardwire, if you want, or make special provisions for, or whether it will appear as a natural consequence of learning predictive models, for example. So if you learn predictive models and you learn the consequences of your actions, then you have to learn causality because you have to learn what the effect, what an intervention is going to do. That's basically causal inference. That said, there's a lot of really interesting work on causal inference going on at the moment by people like Bernard Schulkopf at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, by Léon Bautou, who's at Facebook in New York, David Lopez-Paz, who's a former student of Bernard Schulkopf working at Facebook Care Research in Paris. So there's a lot of situations where causal inference can play a very important role, particularly when you have sort of closed loops of causal interactions, and a good example of this is actually a very good paper by Léon Bautou from several years ago, from when he was working at Microsoft, where he kind of designed all their system for ad placement for Bing, and I realized that all kinds of loops of interactions, sort of loopy sort of causal relationships where you can decrease the price of this ad, but then it's going to be shown more because now it's cheaper, and so are people going to click on it more? But if they click more on it, and then they get bored by it, so the price is going to go up. I mean, there's all those things. So the question is, which variable can you influence to actually have the effect that you're looking for? So control of dynamical systems. That's a really interesting question.
Thank you very much for your sharing. I have a question about generative adversarial networks. We see that recent GANs are able to generate high quality and realistic images. When our goal is to improving recognition performance, data data augmentation by GANs are not that successful right now. So my question is, do you have any comment about what is missing in current GANs and what's the challenge of using GANs for data augmentation?
Yeah, I've personally actually pretty much given up on GANs as a way of pre-training for self-supervised learning. I use that for video prediction, for example, as a way to train video prediction systems to deal with the uncertainty in the prediction. And you're right, a lot of people have tried to use GANs as a way to pre-train systems to run representations before you do a subsequent supervised task. And it's pretty much all been a failure. You don't get good features by training a GAN, whether you use the representation in the discriminator or in the generator, even worse with the generator. So it's not clear why. So far, the application of GANs is to generate pretty pictures. That's about it. I mean, it's a very important application. Don't get me wrong, but and it's really impressive what the results are. Although there are other latent variable models that produce pretty pictures as well. But I mean, I'm on the record saying that I think when GAN popped up 5 years ago, that it was the most interesting idea in the last 10 years in machine learning, and I still believe that. So I think it's really cool. I think it's a horrible. It's very complicated to train them. They're very unstable. You have to come up with all kinds of hacks. And the best evidence for this is the fact that there is 400 different types of GANs, which means none of them actually works for anything. So the original formulation of GANs is actually wrong. You have to kind of reformulate them. The best formulation is the Wasserstein GAN, which is more recent. So anyway, it's an unresolved issue, but so far the use of GANs as pre-trained, self-supervised or unsupervised pre-training is invaluable.
So I pretty much agree, because if you look at existing GANs, right? Actually, all the questions came from my team, our research team, because we stuck to make progress. So one example problem is if you give the GAN model red roses, you say, can you generate the entire category of roses of different other colors? And the answer is no way. Because if you generate another color like blue roses or maybe yellow roses, the discriminator will just reject it, saying this is fake. So how to overcome that problem? The solution may not be GAN itself, needs to have a new model.
Yeah, I agree.
Hello, Yann LeCun. I'm John from R&D. I have a question. Just you mentioned before, you say self-supervised can solve car accident detection or estimation. Am I right?
I'm not sure I understand. I think I missed one word that you said.
I mean, you say self-supervised
yes.
can solve car accident detection or estimation.
What you're trying to say is a crucial part of getting to autonomous driving.
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be used somewhere in the, the future history, right? I don't know when. It could be 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. I don't know, because we haven't figured out how to use self-supervised learning in the context of vision yet. At least not to the extent that we'd like. So I don't know. But I think it's going to play a role eventually, yeah. Some form of it.
All right, thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Simona from VR Technologies, and my question is, how can we enhance public perception and understanding of AI?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I do a lot of interviews with the media to try to explain what AI is about and demystify it. I'm writing a book that's coming out soon, actually, so in French first. Maybe in Mandarin at some point. I think it's really important to explain how those things work, because conceptually it's not that complicated. I think the best, when I was younger, I read a little book written by Richard Feynman, the famous physicist. The title is QED, Quantum Electrodynamics, and Feynman explains the basic principles behind quantum electrodynamics without any math, basically. No equations. And explains all the idea of quantum interference, all that stuff, and explains the basic phenomenon that you observe every day. Why the sky is blue and when you get those iridescent, colorful things on an oil layer, and all that stuff. And I found this book really great because it explains the ideas without complexity, and I think it would be good to do something similar for AI backprop neural nets, that stuff. That's what I'm trying to do with that book.
I think there was one last question.
I have questions about conversational AI. Currently, the rule-based approach still outperforms deep learning in many conversational AI competition. So, do you think the pure data-driven method is the right approach?
Well, eventually, yes, but again, it's probably going to take some progress in, kind of self-supervised learning like things. So, take a very simple, not really conversational, but sort of speech-driven things like Amazon Alexa or something like this. There's very, very simple dialogue taking place with the user. And the intent classification is actually done with a neural net. Okay, so there is machine learning there. There's about 80 different things that Alexa can do for you, and you say something, and there is some neural net that is going to make a classification into one of those 80 categories. And then there is some sort of rule-based system to actually go, fetch the information in your sentence and ask you the right question for how to answer all that stuff. There's really interesting work in, fully sort of end-to-end trained dialogue systems. The concept for it goes back a long time. In the mid-90s, some former colleagues at AT&T actually who had the idea of training a dialogue system using reinforcement learning. It was a complete failure. There were other attempts more recently, and the reason it's a failure is because it requires just too many trials in interaction with the person, and it will never get anywhere in a reasonable amount of time. So I think machines need to have a lot more sort of background knowledge about the world before we can have dialogue systems that can be trained in a reasonable amount of time. But there is progress.
All right, so thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm pretty sure that everyone has learned a lot. There's a lot of food for thought. And with AI being such a crucial part of the future and such big impact, it's really important to continue to increase the understanding. It's really important to continue the discussions so that we can have openness that is open to different possibilities, as well as understanding of making the right decision, making the right choices. So I want to end this with what Yann just reminded us. The most important thing is that we all keep learning. Thank you.
So we really thank you, Yann, for coming here, and we want Yann to come more often. So share, and Eve gonna give Yann some gifts. Eve gonna give Yann the blockchain phone Exodus. That's the first blockchain phone in the world, and then that's from a French man to another French man to make sure. And the Cher gonna give Yann the Taiwan mountain tea. So we want Yann to really, not only enjoy the technology, but enjoy the nature of Taiwan. So you can come back to Taiwan more often in the future. Come back to HTC more often. Thank you, Yann, very much. Thank you.